Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nobnabnarp, and today it's time for another character study in the Psychology of Gaming series. So, if you're anything like me, you've just thoroughly enjoyed playing Insomniac's Spider-Man over the last few weeks, and if you haven't finished it yet, this video does contain story spoilers, so you have been warned. Spider-Man villains are some of my favorites to learn about because they usually create a conflict between Peter's personal life and his duties as Spider-Man. Take Doc Ock for example. He's Peter Parker's greatest scientific mentor, but our hero is forced to stop his idol's wrongdoing once the great scientist becomes corrupted. This dissonance creates many interesting stories, as Peter must overcome his personal connection to that person in order to fulfill his duties as Spider-Man, despite the consequences that it may have for him. Spider-Man stories almost always contain relatable elements or themes such as sacrifice, and I think that's why he's beloved by so many people. Anyway, the villain in Spider-Man's most recent outing is one I had never heard of before playing the game: Martin Li, aka Mr. Negative. Li is a complex character who clearly symbolizes the duality of good and evil that constantly tries to manifest in all of us. So today, in this episode of Psychology of Gaming, the series where we look at how psychological principles are shown off in games and how games can affect us psychologically, we look at Martin Li and how his inner conflict perfectly encapsulates some of the principles of Jungian psychology. Now you may be saying, what the hell is Jungian psychology? Did you just sneeze before you said the word psychology? What the heck is that word? What is Jungian? Well, patience, my friend. We will get there all in due time. But for now, let's have a look at Martin Li's biography and personality. Martin Li, aka Mr. Negative, is a relatively new adversary of Spider-Man, as his debut in the comics took place only 11 years ago in May of 2007, but this was only a cameo. Li's first major appearance took place in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 546 in January of 2008. Traditionally, Li has appeared as a crime lord in the Chinatown area of Manhattan, but he isn't a total one-dimensional villain. You see, Li's character is very much inspired by the Chinese philosophical principle of Yin and Yang. You've almost certainly seen the symbol representing Yin and Yang. It's one of the most recognizable symbols in world culture today, and for good reason. The principle of Yin and Yang relates to balance and states that our world is made up of opposite forces that are attracted to one another and are unable to exist without the other. This principle can be applied to almost every facet of our world. There's day and night, love and hate, order and chaos. We see this represented in the symbol by having two identical shapes, one black and one white, connecting to form a perfect, harmonious circle. You may also notice a white dot within the black region of the circle and a black dot within the white region. This represents another characteristic of Yin and Yang, that being that these opposites that create balance in our world may also exist within one another. In other words, they are interconnected and inseparable. Martin Li perfectly encapsulates the principle of Yin and Yang, as both good and evil are a part of his existence. On one hand, Li is the operator of Feast, a community program designed to help feed, clothe, and shelter the needy. On the other hand, we have Li's alter ego, Mr. Negative, who is a brutal mob boss focused solely on the destruction of Mayor Norman Osborn's reputation, even at the cost of destruction in Manhattan and the loss of innocent lives. These two sides of Li are seemingly aware of one another, but don't attempt to stop one another, and this makes sense given his character is based on Yin and Yang. These two sides cannot exist without one another, and they represent balance. Unfortunately for Manhattan though, Mr. Negative's ultimate goal of revenge on Osborn creates only chaos within the city. So therefore, it's our job as Spider-Man to bring a halt to his plan. Interestingly enough though, as I played through the game's campaign, the character-defining conflict that stuck out to me the most for Li was not the philosophical one of Yin and Yang, but a psychological one outlined by Carl Jung. Jung was a 20th century Swiss psychologist who is most well known for being one of the first psychologists to offer up alternative ideas of analyzing and exploring human behavior instead of just relying on the methods and ideas that were presented by the grandfather of psychology, Sigmund Freud. In his younger years, you see what I did there? It's a younger, it's his last name, but it's a little fun little play on words there for you. Oh God, what is wrong with me? Carl worked closely with Freud, but eventually the two had a falling out as Jung's perception for where the field of psychology needed to go next was far different than his mentor's. You know, there's no real easy way to say this, but Freud kind of thought that all of our thoughts and behaviors were driven by sexual desire, and Jung was kind of like, No, you don't. You can stop being creepy, Freud. That's enough of that. It's not all about sex. Jung believed that to limit the human mind to just being motivated by sexuality was too narrow a thought process, as he believed other factors influenced human behavior. Amongst his many contributions to the field of psychology, Jung is perhaps best known for his theory on individuation. Individuation, according to Jung, is a lifelong process that all humans engage with, and is an attempt to find a definitive sense of self and to express that version of yourself confidently. It is that point in which you find peace within your sense of expression and act harmoniously with it while not compromising on your role within society. It's all about creating a balancing act. Individuation, though, is not an easy process, and Jung believed it could never be truly accomplished, but instead that our life's goal is to become closer and closer to that point. And he called that point self-actualization, which is a concept I talked about in this episode of Psychology of Gaming that you should check out when this video's done. The link is in the upper right-hand corner. Anyway, Jung theorized that there are other factors that influence our psychological development and our attempts to reach self-actualization, and he called these factors archetypes. For this video, I want to focus on two of these archetypes and show how they relate to our good old friend, Martin Lee. Let's start by talking about what Jung called the persona. No, not that persona. Oh God, definitely not that persona. No. Jung described the persona archetype as our personality that we project onto others when we are in social situations. Living in a society makes it very difficult to show off our true selves because there is always a certain amount of social pressure on us to conform to society's standards. This is why it makes us uncomfortable when we see that soccer mom yelling at an employee, or why you don't choose a different seat to sit in every day in class. There are social rules that we choose to follow in order to avoid creating a social punishment for ourselves and ostracism from those around us. Part of this means that we must alter our personalities in order to conform to society's expectations for us. We don't change our personalities completely, but they certainly become manipulated in social situations because we as humans like to feel a sense of belongingness. So you can think of the persona archetype as a metaphorical mask that you wear out in public to appease people and gain respect and acceptance. For me, I believe Martin Lee's persona archetype is represented in his work at the Feast Shelter. Despite being the mind-controlling mob boss of Chinatown, Lee still takes time to look after the needy and works diligently to make sure they are cared for. He hides away his alter ego and puts on a metaphorical mask in order to become more respected and well-liked within his community. Everyone seems to recognize how much Lee has contributed to the city and are grateful for his help. To me, this is the true Martin Lee, the one that would exist naturally if not for the unfortunate event that took place at the beginning of his life. But because that event did happen, this good side of Lee is a part of his persona archetype. It's the version of himself he wants to project onto the world around him. Eventually though, he does become corrupted completely, and his persona gives way completely to his negative side. And that brings us to what Jung called the shadow archetype. It is normal for humans to try to suppress negative emotions and events that have shaped their lives, but Jung believed that repressing these memories instead of dealing with them emotionally is what creates the shadow archetype within us. These memories can be anything really, a bad breakup, the death of a loved one, or really anything that has caused feelings of sadness, anger, or guilt within you. The shadow archetype limits us and holds us back from reaching a point of self-actualization because we are trapping negative emotions within the mind. We can only grow as people when we deal with failure or negativity instead of just bottling it up, which leads us to be stagnant and non-changing. Repressing negative emotions can lead to a negative buildup within our personality, and that can really affect how we think, act, and speak. You can think of the shadow archetype as your inner demons. Martin Lee and Peter Parker both have shadow archetypes, but have handled them in different ways. For Peter, the death of his uncle has always been a driving force in his life, and it would have been very easy to let that death consume him and to use his powers selfishly. But Peter took the time to grieve with his aunt and to deal with the emotions and feelings he was experiencing, and that is what allows him to do good as Spider-Man. As for Lee, he never dealt with his inner demons, and they ultimately consumed him. If humanity's goal is to reach self-actualization, then Lee is moving backwards. It is revealed through the events of the game that Norman Osborn created a chemical compound called Devil's Breath that he hoped could be used to save his son Harry from an uncurable medical condition. During the testing phase, Lee was one of the patients who was administered Devil's Breath, and unfortunately for him, the test didn't go to plan. The medicine had an adverse effect on Lee, granting him superpowers, but the resulting transformation ended up killing his mother and his father. Lee was forced to confront the guilt of killing his parents, but instead of dealing with that negative emotion, he bottled it up and always blamed Norman Osborn for the death of his parents. The repression of this very serious and complex issue, alongside of his new powers, led to Lee's corruption and ultimately the birth of Mr. Negative. Martin allowed this negative side to have more control over his personality by giving into his desire for revenge. He began wearing an old Chinese opera mask of a demon and corrupted people around him to do his bidding, in hopes that someday he would make Osborn pay for the death of his family. It is quite fitting that when Lee dons the demon mask, it symbolizes allowing the demons within him to come to the surface and overtake his personality. In fact, Peter Parker himself even comments on this within the game.
He sure is obsessed with masks. Is it a Jungian thing? Like, he needed to pretend to be someone else to let his darkest feelings out? Pretended to be a demon, until he became one.
As the game progresses, Lee becomes more and more consumed by his hatred of Osborn, and this leads to a lot of chaos within the city. We witness a bombing at City Hall that kills many, including Miles Morales' father, and if it hadn't been for us as Spider-Man, the city may have fallen into Lee's control. Lee fully intended to use Devil's Breath as a weapon against the city, punishing its people for his perception of Osborn's actions. Thankfully, we defeat Martin Lee before this plan comes to full fruition in the game's second act. Of course, it doesn't last for long. I mean, stupid Doc Ock and his badass mechanical octopus arms messing everything up. However, in the end, Spider-Man prevails and reinforces the theme that dealing with your shadow archetypes makes you a better and more successful person. And it contributes to Jung's work, and it's a testimony to that work as well. Peter dealt with his negative emotions, and that allows him to overcome the trials and tribulations that he faces in the game, while meanwhile, Lee fails to do the same. If you were to strip away all the superpowers, you would have a very realistic take on how failure to deal with negative emotions can lead to a destructive path in a human being's life. The shadow archetype within us needs to be dealt with, and this is of course easier said than done, but it is the only way that we can find peace within ourselves and live harmoniously and fruitfully. Carl Jung's work encouraged us to keep growing as human beings and not take the easy way out when it comes to expressing our truest selves. Peter Parker has taken active steps to reach this point of self-actualization, while the tragedy of Martin Lee is that he failed to deal with his problems and feelings and was ultimately consumed because of it. It is a very human lesson that I think everyone can learn from. For me, it may end up being what I remember most about this game. And even though I'm sure Lee's character motivations evolved around the Yin and Yang principle, it's still interesting to see bits of psychological theories sprinkled in throughout the game. So that about wraps it up for me. I hope you enjoyed this quick look at Martin Lee's character and that you learned something too. If you have any questions or want to hear more about Carl Jung, comment below and I'll be sure to answer. If you're feeling up to it, check out some of my other videos in the series as well. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.